Hi, Govan, and welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and I've mentioned before that a Patreon patron requested that I do a video on details that Peter Jackson got right in the Hobbit trilogy, which I wasn't planning to do because I wasn't really interested in watching those films again. Not that they're horrible movies, but they're just so disappointing. At any rate, I am now fulfilling my obligation on that. This will be the first of two or three. I've gotten through the first movie. I don't know how many I'm going to find in the second and third movies, so I'm not going to promise 3 videos on this. But there's enough out of the first movie that I could make a video out of it. So this is going to be part 1 of details that Peter Jackson got right in the Hobbit trilogy, specifically from the first movie, The Unexpected Journey. We begin with the prologue, which of course this is a Peter Jackson Middle-earth trilogy. It has to have a prologue, right? The prologue doesn't happen in the book, but in the context of the movie, I don't hate it because, as I've said before in other contexts, I actually think the best idea for making the Hobbit trilogy, if you're going to make it after the Lord of the Rings trilogy, is to bring in, the appendices stuff from the Lord of the Rings and all that, and really contextualize it the way that Tolkien kind of retcons it later on. So I don't hate the fact that there's a prologue, but the thing that I want to draw out of the prologue specifically is the whole bit where they talk about the origins of the hatred between elves and dwarves. And it's interesting because this detail really kind of harks back to the Beren and Luthien story. Not specifically the Beren and Luthien story, but, somewhere in that realm, because it's the aftermath of the Beren and Luthien story, really, because it's when Thingol gets the Silmaril and he wants the dwarves to make a necklace to hold the gem, and then they make it, but then they want to keep the gem, and they kind of echo that in the prologue to The Hobbit, which is also kind of sort of echoed in The Hobbit itself, because a lot of the stuff in The Hobbit really is an echo of Thingol and all that stuff from Doriath, because Thranduil is basically discount bin Thingol. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but Tolkien basically just borrowed from his mythology, recast it in The Hobbit, and then had to make it like a totally different set of characters when he incorporated The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings into his broader mythology. Menegroth ends up being the Thranduil's caves in Mirkwood. I mean, that's where that came from. It just is. So the fact that they kind of threw that in there about where the enmity between dwarves and elves came from and how they incorporate that into the prologue, it actually is pretty accurate to actually why dwarves and elves kind of started hating each other. So even though it's not specifically a thing that gets dealt with huge in The Hobbit, the book, I do actually appreciate the reference because, like I said, the prologue, I think, actually was the right way to go about it if you were going to do The Hobbit after The Lord of the Rings. Before we get into the story proper, we still have sort of a framing device where Bilbo is talking to Frodo just before the 111th birthday party and before Gandalf arrives and all that stuff that we see at the very beginning of the Fellowship. And Frodo talks about the rumor that he has just mounds and mounds of gold. And Bilbo says, it was just one small chest and it still smells of troll. Well, that's pretty much true. I mean, what he ends up bringing back at the end of The Hobbit is, in fact, just one of the chests that they buried that was from the troll horde, which, the whole troll incident happens in the first movie anyway. But that's the only treasure he brings back. He doesn't really bring back much of anything from the mountain. It's mainly the troll treasure that he gets, and it is just one small chest. So, that's a detail that was interesting to throw in there and wasn't really necessary, especially because we don't need to know that until the very end. But now we kind of get it spoiled a little bit. This next bit is a bit of a mixed bag because when we start getting the dwarves arriving for their dinner/tea party at Bilbo's, we get this, the arrival of the dwarves in sequence is mostly correct. He does kind of mess up a couple things, because in the book, what we don't have is Bifur, Bofer, and Bombur arriving with Thorin. That doesn't really happen. It's Thorin, well, let me say, This next bit is a bit of a mixed bag because in the book and in the movie we get more or less the same order of dwarves arriving at Bag End for their dinner party, except at the very end the movie messes it up, because in the movie we get Thorin arriving last and all alone, whereas in the book he actually arrives with Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur. But if you track the order of the arrival of the dwarves otherwise, it's actually entirely correct. So the only thing they did was just kind of separate Thorin out by himself to kind of dramatize the whole, ooh, this is the, the big deal guy that we need to care about. Which, it's not necessarily the best idea, I don't think, but, it makes sense why they would do that for the movie, because they are trying to set Thorin up as a big deal, which Thorin is a big deal, but they make him a big deal in a way that he's not really in the book. But, like I said, for the most part, it's 100% accurate, because the order at least is correct, and other than that one grouping, the groupings themselves are actually correct too. Next point I want to talk about is one that this is one that I'm really genuinely surprised about, and it's also one that I was really happy about for the most part. And they do some things that I'm not especially a fan of occasionally with this, but the inclusion of the songs. And this is surprising because Lord of the Rings didn't do that at all, hardly. I mean, there's maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 songs sung in the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy. We've got Eowyn's Lament when they bury Theodred. We've got, well, there's actually at least 4 now that I think about it. But, I mean, most of them are not straight out of the book. You've got Aragorn quietly singing, apparently, the Lay of Leithian. You've got Pippin singing for Denethor, which is an amalgamation, or maybe it's just a really shortened version of one of the songs. And then you've got Merry and Pippin singing in Meduseld when they're basically doing a drinking song. But most of the songs are not really, they're kind of background elements to other things and not really the focus for the most part. Whereas here, in The Hobbit, we actually get several songs that are very much the focus. Chip the Glasses and Crack the Plates is the first one we get. And the moment that I saw that on screen, I was like, yes, we actually get some of this. And then they do, the dwarves' song of the Misty Mountain, or far o'er the Misty Mountain's cold. And you gotta say, that version of the song is really good. I still prefer, possibly just out of nostalgia, the Rankin Bass versions of a lot of these songs. But Far Over the Misty Mountain's Cold in this one is a really good version. It's solid. And the fact that they included as many of these songs as they did is great. Now, I will say there's things that annoy me, because I don't remember if this is only in the extended edition or if it's also in the theatrical version, but the dwarves, when they're in Rivendell, they sing the Man in the Moon song, which is not in the Hobbit, it's only in the Lord of the Rings. It's like, why did you need to do that? But, the fact that they included the songs that they did and really made them prominent was a big deal to me. Next, we get Gandalf having a conversation with Bilbo after Bilbo has fainted. And Gandalf is trying to kind of build up his courage a bit and really impress upon him the fact that just because you're a stay-at-home hobbit now doesn't mean you can't be brave enough to go on an adventure and do great things. And he tells him the story of his ancestor, the Bullroarer, Took, who was big enough to ride a horse, and he killed the goblin leader by swinging his club so hard that he knocked his head off, and it went into a rabbit hole. Thus, the battle was won, and the game of golf invented at the same time. Now, in the context of the movie, we might just take this as this is one of those humorous things that Peter Jackson does in The Hobbit that he doesn't do as much in The Lord of the Rings. But this story is actually straight out of the book. This is actually a thing. So the fact that Gandalf gets to say this line, and, well, when I say it's straight out of the book, I can't remember if it's out of The Hobbit or if it's out of the appendices, or maybe it's even the prologue to The Lord of the Rings. But it's out of one of the 2 books, I know. And the fact that they actually brought that up and had that in there, even as a slight joke, because in the book version of it, you get the idea that it is mostly completely serious, although, in The Hobbit, a lot of things are slightly tongue-in-cheek. But here, Gandalf in the movie admits that it's, partially legendary probably, and maybe a lot legendary. But even if taking it differently than the movie, than the book, it's still an element that I'm kind of surprised they put in there, which is actually 100% accurate, which you wouldn't even necessarily expect. Next one is not a huge surprise in one sense, because it is kind of an important element of setting up Bilbo's character for just how attached he is to comforts. But it is an important detail, and important enough that I think it's worth noting. When Bilbo joins the dwarves after he's finally made the decision to go on the adventure after all, he ends up noticing that he has not brought a pocket handkerchief and therefore has to go back and get one. This is not exactly the way it goes down in the book, but it is definitely a thing that is mentioned in the book, that he doesn't have a pocket handkerchief, and he complains about this, and he's told by Gandalf, you'll have to do without pocket handkerchiefs and a lot of other things before you're done with this adventure. And it is a detail, like I said, which is important to setting up Bilbo's character and the way that he progresses for the rest of the story, both in the book and in the movie, because both versions of the story do focus, though I think to differing degrees, on Bilbo's change from being a stay-at-home fuddy-duddy to being willing at least to engage with the outside world and have an adventure, but still appreciate the things of home. So the fact that they included this, even though it's not a big deal and it would almost be kind of expected, is, I think, it definitely worth, giving some kudos for, because it's like if you hadn't, it would have been kind of a problem. This next one is another area in which I think you can really say that they definitely kind of caught the real point of the book and made sure to focus on it, and that is when Elrond reads the moon letters in the map. Because in both the book and the movie, we get this reference to the fact that you can only read the moon letters by the light of the same moon on the same day. So it has to be the same phase of the moon on the same day of the year, and it just so happens that the dwarves are there at the right time. And Elrond in the movie specifically mentions fate seems to be on your side. And of course, this is the point, right? The whole point is that this whole enterprise seems to be destined or guided by providence or something. And the fact that they went out of their way to mention that in the movie, I thought was mildly surprising and definitely worth noting, because it's not necessarily the kind of thing that Peter Jackson often throws in, these kind of references to fate and providential guidance. So I was mildly surprised when they did that, and I thought it was definitely a really good thing that they put in there, because it does highlight that aspect of the story which you can easily overlook. The only thing I don't like about it is right after Elrond gets through saying fate seems to be on your side, he's then like, it's probably a bad idea to do this, though. It's like, well, you just got through. But, that's criticism, not really the point of this video. Next, we get a scene which is completely not in the book, but nevertheless is accurate. And here we go again with the appendices from Lord of the Rings and the recontextualization, because we have, effectively, a meeting of the White Council. And they're talking about what to do about the necromancer, what the motivations for even doing this whole dwarf quest thing are. They're questioning Gandalf and all this other stuff. And the motivations that Gandalf has for engaging in this whole enterprise in the first place match up exactly with the stuff that he says in the appendices in The Lord of the Rings, where he's telling, the hobbits in Minas Tirith after everything's kind of done and they're waiting for Arwen to arrive. His whole motivation was the dragon doesn't really need to be left alone as just a player on the board that could end up signing with Sauron, because that would be really dangerous. And the fact that they brought that in, they didn't have to go unfinished tales and all that stuff, because look at the other things that they did in these movies, like making the Witch King of Angmar somebody who died a long time ago and now suddenly just comes back as part of the Necromancers thing, instead of being the Lord of the Nazgul who's been around for thousands of years, just regardless. So they messed up a lot of the actual history that's behind The Hobbit. So it's not really clear that they had to stick with the unfinished tales / appendices information as far as all the other stuff. So it's kind of surprising, actually, that they did in a way. And I'm glad that they did, even though it's not straight out of The Hobbit. It is straight out of Tolkien's own recontextualization of The Hobbit. So that made me happy as well, even if they did kind of fudge around some of the other stuff. Here's another one that was really surprising to me, because this is another one of those areas where it doesn't really seem to fit with the whole Lord of the Rings, style of storytelling and everything that happens in it. We get the episode of the stone giants having a thunder battle, as Balin calls it. And this is straight out of the book. There actually is a reference to stone giants throwing big boulders around in the Misty Mountains. And this is one of those things that Tolkien kind of shies away from a little bit when he gets into Lord of the Rings. And there aren't all these just kind of larger-than-life, bizarre, kind of magical creatures out there. I mean, there still are some, obviously. You've got the eagles, you've got other things. But you get the idea that some of the stuff that gets mentioned in The Hobbit is really kind of either Bilbo's imagination or his, not necessarily imagination like he hallucinated it, but like his imagination in terms of making the story more interesting for young hobbits to read, maybe. And, or if not that, maybe it's, just some other reason that this got thrown in there. You kind of forget about the stone giants after reading The Hobbit and then reading The Lord of the Rings, because that kind of thing never really comes up again. But there it is in the text, and there it is in the movie. So, they didn't shy away from it, which I'll give them props for, because after having The Lord of the Rings and then throwing in the stone giants seems really bizarre. So the fact that they had the guts to do that is, kudos to them. Next, we end up in the goblin tunnels in the Misty Mountains, and Bilbo, of course, gets lost and ends up having his riddle game with Gollum. They actually cut short some of the riddles. The riddles they do are correct, but that's not what I find interesting about this one. The interesting thing about this particular part of the movie is that whenever Gollum is trying to figure out what is in Bilbo's pocket, he's thinking out loud to himself, and he starts saying things like goblin's teeth, bat wings, and those are actually things which, according to the narrator in The Hobbit, because Gollum doesn't say it out loud, he was thinking of in terms of what would he keep in his own pockets. Goblin's teeth, bat wings, he goes down a list. And the list is the same, and it's one of those things where it was completely unnecessary to put that in, but I love the fact that they pulled that detail of the Hobbit narrator, who obviously is not omniscient and can't actually know what's going on in Gollum's mind. Gollum, who probably doesn't even actually have a pocket in the final, conception of who Gollum is and what he probably is wearing. But the fact that they went in and found that detail and pulled it out and were like, oh yeah, we could just actually make that some of his own internal monologue that he's just outwardly vocalizing. I thought that was a great touch. Final point from the unexpected journey is basically almost the very end, where they're having to fight off wargs and orcs and hiding in the pine trees. Or not hiding, but at least, trying to get away from the wargs and the pine trees. The fact that they actually have Gandalf lighting pine cones on fire and throwing them down, again, this is one of those things where you would almost expect Peter Jackson to do something different, because it seems kind of odd after you've gone through the Lord of the Rings and all this other stuff and seen what Gandalf can really do. So the fact that they actually stuck to the actual book version of that, even though they messed up, the context of how they got into those trees and who these wargs are and all this other stuff, they changed so many things surrounding it, but they kept that one element of Gandalf is using fire and pine cones, which, it's a small detail, but it's one that I appreciate the fact that they actually kept to it. So, there is your list of details that Peter Jackson got right in The Unexpected Journey. I'll be watching the other two movies and pulling anything I can out of those, so be aware of that in the future. I'll be putting those out at some point. Not sure how long it'll take me to get through all of that. Half the time I'm trying to watch movies just in the morning while I'm doing laundry or something, so who knows how long it'll take me to get there, but it is going to happen. So it's on the way, but there's probably going to be other stuff in the middle. If you enjoyed this one, please make sure you give it a thumbs up and share it around. Make sure you subscribe to catch all my future content, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions every week, and check out the other social and support links in the description as well. Until the next time, I am the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.